Hello and welcome to Africa Live. Today we bring you a 45-minute special program focused on Sudan. We'll be speaking to our correspondents on the ground as well as analysts. We'll also be unpacking some of the harrowing experiences ordinary people have been through since the conflict began. There are currently efforts being made on multiple fronts to bring the war in Sudan to an end. We'll be exploring those initiatives too. I'm Hannah Vivier in Nairobi. Our special program on Sudan begins now. The conflict in Sudan has been raging for the past 18 months between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces. Fighting first broke out in the capital Khartoum in April of 2023 before spreading to other areas of the country, including the Darfur region. Now, with the end of the rainy season, which hampered movement on the ground, fighting has once again intensified. Khartoum is the site of the latest escalation. The army has launched a major offensive to retake areas under RSF control, but Sudan's civil war has plunged the country into a humanitarian crisis. The UN has expressed deep concern over the continued displacement of civilians. The UN Secretary General's spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, said in the first week of October alone, close to 25,000 people arrived in eastern Chad. That mass exodus is the highest number of new arrivals within a single week this year. Well, Naba Mukhideen joins us from Port Sudan with the latest. Hi there, Naba. Good to see you and welcome to our special program on Sudan. Naba, give us a sense of what the current situation is in Sudan.
Hi, Hannah. The situation in Sudan, as you said, remains very fragile and very violent for 18 months right now. People are struggling every day, and every single day the fighting continues. People are suffering more. Millions now are facing the risk of famine. Millions have uprooted from their homes. The fighting is threatening many things. It's threatening the unity of the country. It's threatening the livelihood of people. It's threatening with the total collapse of the country economically, politically, and of course the country generally. So the situation is really bad, and it's getting worse and worse every day because it's very obvious that the two warring parties decided to escalate, and no one will de-escalate. And as we know that all of the efforts to end this chaotic conflict have so far failed. So the situation is really bad right now. There is no much fighting and clashes. There is some clashes in Al-Fashir, clashes in Durman, but the situation is calmer than the weeks before after the military gained control of some parts of the capital and some parts of Sinnar, the strategic Jebel Moya region. But generally the humanitarian situation is declining, and it's really dire for millions of people who are struggling and who are hoping to see the fighting ends very soon.
Well, now we're talking about that hope to see the fighting end. There had been talk of the two rivals maybe coming together to resolve the conflict in Sudan. What is the latest on peace efforts? Well, we seem to have lost Naba there, but we will hopefully be able to have her back on the program. Well, the Sudan conflict remains a point of international concern as fighting continues to devastate that nation. CGTN's Daniel Arab Moy gives us an overview of the war, which shows little sign of abating.
The Sudan war originated from a conflict between two major military factions in April 2023. But the main actors are the Sudanese armed forces led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, a paramilitary group under the command of General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo. Also active are former Darfur rebel movements and pro-army volunteer groups and militants allied to the former ruling National Congress Party. Now, the current power struggle dates back to the hosting of President Omar al-Bashir in 2019 after long-standing protest. Now, initially, the armed forces and the RSF collaborated to manage Sudan's planned transition to civilian rule. But deep-seated rivalries, disagreements over power sharing, and divergent views on Sudan's future led to escalating tensions between the two. Now, their disputes culminated in open hostilities, plunging the country into chaos. Now, very soon, the conflict took on an international aspect as foreign actors tried to influence proceedings. Now, a report by a 5-member panel of researchers appointed by the UN Security Council reported violations of a long-standing UN arms embargo by the United Arab Emirates. Now, meanwhile, as the war expanded, there were also atrocities reported on both sides. The report estimates the death toll from what is called ethnic cleansing in the Darfur city of El Geneina last year at between 10 and 15,000. The UN panel of experts collected evidence from dozens of victims. The panel concluded the attacks were planned, coordinated, and executed by the Rapid Support Forces and their allied Arab militias. Now, more than 10 million people have been forced to flee their homes in search of safety. Of these, close to 7.9 have been displaced within Sudan, with at least 2.1 million fleeing to neighboring countries like Chad, Central African Republic, Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Egypt. Now, efforts to broker peace have faced significant challenges. Now, talks mediated by international partners have repeatedly stalled, with both sides unwilling to compromise on key issues. The AU and Arab League have urged for an immediate ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid to reach those in need, but tangible progress isn't forthcoming. The situation in the country remains fluid, with potential for either further escalation or a breakthrough in peace talks. Meanwhile, the international community has urged the warring parties to prioritize the welfare of civilians and engage constructively towards achieving a lasting solution to the conflict.
To discuss this further, we're joined by Oluwole Ojewale, Regional Coordinator of the Central Africa Institute for Security Studies in Dakar. Oluwole, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Sudan continues to be a highly concerning conflict, especially impacting the population. How would you describe the current security situation across Sudan?
Thank you so much for having me. I think, like we have put it on this program before, and has been reiterated by other experts, the Sudan crisis is about the gravest disaster, humanly induced disaster going on in the world now. Compared to other theaters of conflict in Gaza, in Ukraine, because these matter continue to rage on, while it appears the whole world is now prioritizing humanitarian concern in the country. These ranges from the attacks on civilians, destruction of infrastructure, displacement of people. In fact, the Armed Conflict Event Location Database estimates that between the commencement of the crisis up to October 4th, close to 25,000 people have been killed. I heard the report that you shared in terms of the displacement, which we don't need to reiterate again. And it was underscored the fact that the world continues to look in another direction while pretending to be paying attention to the issues, but not really addressing the humanitarian concern of the people.
Oluwole, you've described some of the hardships that people in Sudan are facing. What more can you tell us about that, and also what you think needs to be done to minimize some of all that suffering?
The number one thing is that the African Union must embrace and demonstrate responsibility on matters relating to Sudan now, because it's a crisis that is raging on our soil, and there's little to which you can rely on external stakeholders who also have interest in the crisis to come and douse the tension at home. So I think the buck stops on the table of African Union now to demonstrate leadership. The second is the regional economic community. They also need to rise up to the occasion. And African leaders as a whole must put an end to the crisis in Sudan by demonstrating leadership and not just paying lip service to it, as we have seen in the past 1 year and a half.
Olawale, thank you so much for all that. Olawale Ojwale, Regional Coordinator at the Central Africa Institute for Security Studies in Dakar. We'll be going for a short break now. When we return, we'll be looking at the displacement and humanitarian crises in Sudan. Do stay tuned. Well, welcome back to our special program on Sudan. Aid agencies, including the UN, say that Sudan is experiencing the world's largest displacement crisis. As the war in Sudan expands, the number of people fleeing continue to rise. CGTN's Najma Abdirazak takes a look at the impact of the fighting on Sudanese civilians.
18 months ago, Sudan's capital, Khartoum, was a bustling metropolis. Along with the adjoining cities of Bahri and Omdurman, the so-called tri-capital was home to some 10 million residents, nearly a fifth of the country's population, and was the primary engine of the national economy. Today, much of it lies in ruins, with many streets largely void of civilian life. The few that remain risk their lives as the shelling and gun battles continue. The army recently stepped up its efforts to take back control of this strategic centerpiece from its adversary, the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The fighting has, of course, expanded, bringing misery in its wake. There's hardly a community across the country which has not been impacted, as people fled the fighting for anywhere they will feel safe. In June this year, the UN Refugee Agency told the world just how bad it was. It called it the world's largest displacement crisis. Since the beginning of the conflict in April last year, more than 14 million Sudanese have fled their homes, with the vast majority remaining in the country. Neighboring Chad has accepted the largest number of refugees, followed by Egypt, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic. In recent months, the country's displacement crisis was compounded by another shock: severe flooding. The UN said more than 180,000 people were affected across 15 states. Before the conflict, Sudan had already been experiencing humanitarian problems. Long-term political instability and economic pressures had left some 15 million people in need of aid. This conflict has sent that number soaring to almost 25 million, impacting more than half of the country's total population. The warring parties continue to ignore calls to both end the fighting and facilitate the humanitarian effort, so that means the dire situation will likely continue to worsen. Najma Abdirazak, CGTN.
Sudan's hunger crisis has placed it among the top 4 in the world with the highest prevalence of global acute malnutrition. Aid agencies say they're struggling to respond to food shortages as humanitarian access is severely restricted in conflict-affected areas. Caroline B. has more on the situation at displacement camps, including the Zamzam camp, where the UN has declared famine. Please be warned that some viewers may find the following images disturbing.
People in this camp have lost everything, their lives destroyed by the ongoing fighting, which has devastated agricultural lands and infrastructure. They have nothing to eat, and many of them know someone who has starved to death while trying to get to safety. Rose Flegg and other women who fled from Kadugli in South Kordofan wake up early every morning to make a 2-hour trek to the nearby bushes to gather leaves, which they later boil to dull their hunger and that of their children.
I'm scared of being here because I don't know if I will live or I will die. I don't know. I only surrender to God. I might die like those who died on the road.
Rose is one of the 25 million people in Sudan facing high levels of food insecurity. The elderly are suffering disastrous levels of hunger, but children in particular are most at risk of developing severe acute malnutrition, the most life-threatening form. The UN Refugee Agency estimates over 20 million people are in need of food assistance. In North Darfur, the Zamzam camp for internally displaced people has already passed famine thresholds.
It's those states, the Kordofans, Darfur, that have less access to aid, have the highest levels of food insecurity and associated acute malnutrition. Around 15% of children are acutely malnourished. Over 30% are chronically malnourished. Also, between 60 and 80% of hospitals in those hard-to-reach states are either non-functioning or only partially functioning.
Famine conditions began in June and are expected to persist and even worsen further into 2025, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. As peace efforts fail, the Sudanese people are caught in the crosshairs of starvation as humanitarian agencies continue to sound the alarm on the crisis. Caroline B., CGTN.
Dr. Mukesh Kapila, former UN resident and humanitarian coordinator for Sudan, joins us now for further insight on the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. He's based in Geneva. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Doctor, we hear how dire the situation in Sudan is, but I don't know, when we hear about all the statistics and the numbers, if those of us who are not in Sudan truly grasp just how severe the situation there is. What is the current famine and hunger crisis being seen across Sudan?
I think the situation is completely catastrophic, as has been described by your correspondents and others. At least half the population, roughly 25 million, are in need of some aid, and maybe 2/3 of them, 20-odd million, are in need of food aid. And the crisis affects all parts of the country, every state, but is worst in the Darfur region in Western Sudan, and also in the Nuba Mountains, the South Kordofan region, and in other states. And of course, apart from food, we have a complete destruction of healthcare, which means that communicable diseases like cholera and so on are running amok in places, especially because at the moment we have the rainy season, we have malaria, and then of course we have people with chronic diseases who are like blood pressure problems, who are not being able to get their treatments as well. So we have a devastating situation, and more than anything else, it's the desperation of the people, because they spend a lot of their day struggling to just live in the middle of all the atrocities that are also being committed on them at the same time.
So what we also know, Doctor, is that in conflict zones, usually one of the main challenges is getting aid to those who need it most. What is the distribution of aid been like in Sudan?
Well, the distribution problems are amongst the most difficult I have ever come across in my 30, 40 years of experience in the humanitarian world. Remember that Sudan is a very big country, and even at the best of times, it has a long logistics chains. The roads are not very good, and it's extremely expensive to transport relief items from one place to another. Now, amidst this war, which has been going on for a year, we have different warring groups who are obstructing the flow of aid, and they're also looting the aid, and they're also attacking aid workers. So those who are rash enough to actually work as humanitarian workers in the country, they are taking risks every day. So that's one problem. The other problem is that to access the aid that does get delivered to communities, it all depends on whose side you're on. So the RSF people, they have their own clients. The Sudanese army has its own clients. And so for ordinary people, you're caught in the middle. So it's like a big tragic lottery. That's what's going on. The other problem we have is that aid, of course, can be brought in from surrounding countries, cross-border aid. And there were talks in Geneva recently about improving the flow of aid from across the border. Well, things improved a little bit for a few weeks, but now they're back at their old situation with aid being blocked at the entry points from Chad and also from South Sudan.
Truly a dire situation. Dr. Mukesh Kapila, thank you so much for all that. That was Dr. Mukesh Kapila, former UN resident and humanitarian coordinator for Sudan. Well, the UN has repeatedly criticized the inadequate international response to the situation in Sudan, how that is impacting the everyday lives of ordinary people in Sudan. Here again is Nawa Mukhideen.
For millions of people across Sudan, life has never been this difficult. The country is in the midst of a civil war, which has caused a serious humanitarian crisis. Since fighting between the Sudanese military and the rival paramilitary Rapid Support Forces started in April last year, thousands have been killed and millions displaced. Public services, including health and education provision, are almost collapsing. Aid agencies have been trying to assist the most affected, but they say more has to be done to ensure those most in need get help urgently.
We need access through cross-line routes and cross-border routes. A. B is once we get with access as well as given the scale of the needs, we need more funding because the needs are enormous, the gaps are huge. We are very grateful to our donors and partners for supporting us and for staying the course for children so far, but we need more funding.
The conflict has resulted in a catastrophic humanitarian situation in Sudan that's been compounded by devastating floods, causing rising disease outbreaks and famine in many regions.
Some food security experts have warned that up to 2.5 million Sudanese people are at risk of dying from starvation by the end of this year. Aid agencies face multiple challenges, including not being able to access millions of people in conflict zones and having to contend with worsening telecommunications, bureaucracy, and limited resources.
Most of the NGOs have created or adopted local strategies to navigate through challenges. For instance, in some areas, the organizations prefer to transfer money through local apps for the beneficiaries rather than sending food supplies throughout unsafe zones. Yet, the biggest challenge remains the lack of funding and the lack of commitment towards Sudan's crisis.
With Sudan's conflict showing no signs of ending soon, millions of people across the country face a catastrophic humanitarian situation which could still worsen further. Naba Muhiddin, CGTN, for Sudan.
As we mentioned earlier, Sudan's conflict has displaced millions of people since the fighting erupted last year. CGTN's Nick Mudimba now explains the numbers of those displaced internally and those who've sought refuge in neighboring countries.
10.8 million people have been internally displaced in Sudan in nearly 18 months of conflict. At least 2.3 million have sought safety in neighboring countries. Those countries include Chad, South Sudan, Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, Central African Republic, Uganda. The Sudan Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan for 2024 states that 15 million people are in need of urgent life-saving health assistance in Sudan, out of whom health cluster partners led by the World Health Organization are targeting 4.9 million people who are most vulnerable. Of the $178 million required for the entire health response this year, only 42.7% had been funded as of August 2024.
Our own Penina Karibe now joins us from our studios right here in Nairobi, as well as Faith Kasina, UNHCR regional spokesperson for the East, Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region. Thank you so much to you both for joining us. Penina, let's begin with you. You covered Sudanese refugees crossing into Chad. What was your experience, Penina, and can you briefly share what you saw of the refugees' lives in camps there?
Hannah, it's been, I could just sum it in one word, heartbreaking, really. Just listening to the tales of these refugees and even seeing the condition in which they arrive into Chad. I've covered this crisis for the last 2 years. I was there last year when it just started. I was back again this year. And Hannah, it just never gets old on you. One thing I have to mention is we have witnessed them, or I have met these refugees just as they've arrived into Chad. And Hannah, they have such harrowing tales to tell of what they have gone through back home and just also the journey that they make coming into Chad. Now, I have to tell you, they arrive really exhausted. Some of them will have walked perhaps for a whole week. And these are people who have children. They've not eaten in days, Hannah. They're sleeping out in the cold. There is no security around them. And some of their relatives get killed along the way. So they arrive in Chad with a lot of trauma. They arrive with absolutely nothing. They arrive hungry, they arrive, some of them sick, they arrive with children who are malnourished. And you can imagine all of those factors combined. Then they get into this country where they sometimes don't even speak the language. And they have to then start to eke out a living out of there. And Hannah, just being there witnessing these new arrivals, just seeing the process through which they have to go before they actually get settled in by the UN Human Rights Commission for Refugees. They have to get registration, and this then allows them to be processed. It allows them to get documents that would then give them access to food rations, to water, to medical care. But before they actually go through that, Hannah, they will have gone through so much. And so just listening to them, seeing them, sometimes they can't even articulate what it is they are seeing, or I mean they're feeling. So just seeing their faces, seeing the condition in which they are, seeing those very small children, Hannah, it's just devastating.
Faith, hearing what Penina said, I'm sure you are so well versed and have so much experience with the stories and can absolutely relate to what she shared there from what you hear and from what you've seen on the ground yourself. Faith, what are agencies like yours doing to help with refugees fleeing Sudan, and how do host countries deal with such situations?
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I think Penina has done a brilliant job just painting the grim reality that we're seeing, not just in Chad, but in the 8 countries that refugees or people fleeing Sudan are arriving into. The people are arriving in border locations where there's limited services, limited access to services that will help them in the immediate and long term. But we're seeing governments standing with these people, opening their borders, letting them in to seek safety and protection. As UNHCR, we're stepping in with local organizations, with national organizations, other UN agencies, and governments themselves to ensure that we're able to provide basic assistance, food, water, shelter, medicine, and healthcare, and anything else that these people who've gone through such immense trauma require to survive for the next few days. And then increasingly working with also development partners, international institutions, to ensure that there are more long-term, more development investment, so that people are able to live dignified lives, even in the areas of displacement. We want to make sure that children are able to go to school. We want to make sure that people have access to adequate healthcare. People have opportunities to earn an income so that they can rely on themselves, support their families, and not just rely on humanitarian assistance.
Okay, let's bring back Penina. Penina, while you were in Chad, what were some of the challenges you saw facing refugees? You've spoken quite a bit about some of those challenges, but I would also like to speak, Penina, you and I have discussed this at length several times when you just came back from Chad, and we spoke about it this morning before the program. And I want to speak about some of the emotional trauma that's often not reported about that these people go through, Penina.
There is a lot of emotional trauma, Hannah. I remember last year sharing with you an experience I had in Fashana refugee camp in Chad of this very small boy, 3 years old, And he saw me and my cameraman. The cameraman had his tripod on the shoulders, and we were filming. The UNHCR was actually constructing houses for the just newly processed refugees. And this small boy saw us. There were two. His older brother was with him, but not much older than him. Couldn't have been more than 7 years old. And when this small boy saw us, he just ran away, screaming hysterically, crying, so afraid. And there were some two gentlemen not too far from where he was, and they went to check up on him. And later they came and they said, oh, he's afraid because he saw the tripod, and he related that to a gun because he had seen the destruction, the death that the gun had caused. And so the tripod, Hannah, you've seen it. It almost would resemble, you know, a gun for somebody who isn't very familiar with that equipment. And so that's what that little boy saw, and that is the trauma he suffered. That is what he expressed, the fear, you know, and he ran away. But beyond that, Hannah, this year when I went back, I spoke to this refugee who was in Farshana camp, and you know, he told me that for him, he cannot believe that this is his life. He showed me pictures on his phone of how his life previously was back in Sudan. He was a wealthy man, you know, he was living a good life, him and his children, and he had, you know, he said he had enough money to take care of himself and his relatives. And he said, look at me now, I have lost everything back home. I am here, housed by the UNHCR, a refugee living in the same house with my mom and my children. And really, Hannah, when we talk about house, it's not really a house, the conventional houses as we know them. These are just small rooms, you know, they could be just two-roomed houses. And so you can imagine even for somebody like that, just reconciling the state of his life today and just thinking back to only last year, the beginning of last year, January. This was a man who could have afforded anything really he wanted. He had dreams, he had, you know, plans for his future and his children's future. Another thing he said, because he was a headmaster of a school there, he told me, you know, Penina, we are here. Chad is not, you know, our country. We speak English back home. It's our official language. Here in Chad, the official language is French. And so when we come here, we have to relearn everything. Our children enroll in schools. They have to be taught in French. They don't understand French. And he said, our children don't even learn our country's history. We're in Chad. We're accommodated by Chad. So we have to learn, or the children have to learn the history of another foreign country. And so there was even that concern of they will never really know the history of their home country. And then there's of course the issue of some of them having witnessed so much atrocities and the perpetrators of those atrocities that they're actually targeted by those perpetrators. And so while in those refugee camps, the UNHCR did tell us that make sure to not film anybody and show their faces if they don't expressly give you the permission to, because they are still hunted to this day by the perpetrators of those atrocities back home. And if they're known where they are, then they become easy targets. So there's just a lot, just beyond, of course, you know, just them acclimatizing to their new lives. There's a lot more they have to deal with. And like you said, a lot more that we journalists don't usually capture when we go to those refugee camps to tell their stories.
Penina, thank you so much for all that. Our own Penina Kariba speaking to us from right here, our studios in Nairobi. And earlier we also had Faith Casina, the UNHCR regional spokesperson for the East, Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region. We're now going to take a short break and return. More to come on Africa Live.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Kanata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa. So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. We're continuing with our special program on Sudan. Well, despite several peace initiatives, there appears to be no end in sight to the fighting in Sudan. CGTN's Robert Nagila takes a look at factors hampering peace efforts both regionally and internationally.
With the conflict in Sudan raging for the past 18 months, several mediation attempts aimed at ending the hostilities have been made and have failed. In 2023, 3 different attempts led by the United States and Saudi Arabia in Jeddah and one initiative by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in Ethiopia's capital Addis Ababa did not yield fruit. An attempt by IGAD to kickstart the peace process ended in controversy after it invited the RSF leader to a summit in Uganda. Sudan's foreign ministry responded by suspending its membership to IGAD. Meanwhile, reconciliation talks were held in Egypt in July and August but ended without much success. An international relations expert says several factors have contributed to the failure of peace talks on Sudan, including the international community's focus on other conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza.
There's been an apparent lack of inclusivity when it comes to some of the main important actors within the theater of the conflict. Number 2, there's been absence of acceptability by either one party or the other, based on the fact that there's a perception of lack of neutrality of a potential mediator, especially, for instance, with regard to the IGAD intervention. 3, there's been an apparent absence of sticks and carrots to ensure that whatever has been agreed upon can actually be enforced. So, meaning there's an incentive to comply, but also a disincentive not to comply because of the consequences that are going to be promised.
Dr. Khanenja says a different approach is required.
There need to be a more concerted but robust, harmonized, both regional as well as international engagement. When you're having competing initiatives that are not speaking to each other, without harmonization, it's going to be extremely difficult to achieve the peace.
Meanwhile, fighting on the ground continues, and until more impetus is given to finding a solution to Sudan's conflict, 2025 is set to be another year of pain and suffering for Sudan's civilian population. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
UN-backed experts are calling for the expansion of an arms embargo on Sudan's long restive Western Darfur region to the entire country. They also want an independent and impartial force created to protect civilians in Sudan. CGTN's Wandra Mugai takes a look at the impact of an extended arms embargo.
A group of Sudanese volunteers are training to support the army on the front lines. Calls to arm the civilians are mounting as the rapid support forces advance south.
We are all ready, me or anyone else, all the young men and brothers, and be on alert. As for the invitation that we received from the Commander-in-Chief, we are ready and fully prepared to come to the battlefield.
After 18 months of war, communities once living in peace are now forced to defend themselves.
Because of the war, the pressures that occurred and the violations that happened to women in general, that prompted me to enter the camp and train so that I could defend myself, my family and the neighborhood I am in. Because when the war began, most of the violations were against women.
In September, the United Nations Security Council extended an arms embargo on Darfur for another 1 year, after experts said it had been regularly violated.
Of course, if the ban is in Darfur, and this is an old decision that is renewed every year, it'll prevent the entry of Emirati weapons that fuel the conflict to a very large extent. And we have seen its effects on citizens in Darfur and in Al-Fasher in particular, especially since the militia targets on an ethnic and racial basis certain components of Darfur society.
The UN-backed experts are now calling for the embargo to be extended to the rest of the country. Army leader General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has also accused the United Arab Emirates of backing the RSF, which the UAE has repeatedly denied.
This has been proven by United Nations reports and is confirmed by monitoring air traffic. Therefore, it is clear and everyone knows that this is a major reason for prolonging the war. The UAE's entry of weapons for rapid support and is in violation of the 1591 United Nations resolution, which criminalizes the entry of weapons into Darfur.
After many failed attempts at a ceasefire, some argue that the only way to silence the weapons is through an expanded arms embargo that would cover all of Sudan. Wanjamungai, CGTN.
Let's now bring in Dr. Hassan Kanenje, Director at the Horn Institute for Strategic Studies based here in Nairobi, as well as Nama Mukhadeen, who is in Port Sudan. Thank you again to you both. Let's start with you, Dr. Kanenje. You know, we've discussed so much about what needs to be done with this conflict. Could you briefly speak to us about what you think have been the issues that have caused so far for there to not be a resolution to this conflict, and what you think can be done to bring an end to the conflict in Sudan?
Yes, a number of things that can be done. There have been attempts to do them, but not sufficiently. One is cessation of hostilities. The parties need to be able to silence the guns and then open humanitarian access to be able to get to, hard to reach places, especially considering the scale of human suffering. Number two, they need to restart the talks between the major conflictants, because this is something that seriously has not been pursued, considering the number of initiatives that have so far failed. Why? In part because there is no robust mechanism that can actually ensure that it succeeds. And finally, there needs to be a more comprehensive regional as well as international approach towards finding a sustainable peace in Sudan. The piecemeal approach to it and desperate attempts by different initiatives, of course, are not exactly speaking to the kind of objectives that is going to contribute to lasting solution and lasting peace in Sudan.
Thank you so much for that. Naba, I'm going to give you the final word as we close the program. This is your country. You have given us such comprehensive and phenomenal reporting on what's been happening over the past, well, more than a year now in Sudan. I'll give you the final word of what you would like to share with us and also what you would like for the world to hear right now.
Actually, Hannah, yes, it was an extraordinary year for not only for me or for the team, but for millions of Sudanese people who suddenly lost their homes, their jobs, their beloved ones, and lost, most importantly, their country. They are seeing their country falling apart. So it was really very hard year for millions of people who are right now separated from their families, losing their money, their jobs, everything have been looted. So it's really very long and very heartbreaking 18 months for Sudanese people. So from my experience, Sudanese people now are very frustrated. Before they were cheerful that the international community, regional and international blocs could stop the war, but now they are convinced that it's in the hands of the Sudanese people and in the hands of the warring generals and in the hands of the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to stop the war. Because whenever we see a glimmer of hope that the conflict will end soon, we see one of the warring parties escalate on the ground and make life more difficult for millions of people. The situation is beyond dire, Hannah, as I mentioned before, not only for the 11 million internally displaced people, but for other millions of 51 million population who are not now they feel they lost Sudan forever. Some people moved on to other countries, started new life outside Sudan, but other people are still can't leave the country. So it's really dark and undefined future for millions of Sudanese people, for 19 million children.
Naba, we're going to have to leave it there. I am so sorry to cut you off. Such important information that you were giving us, but we do have to end the program because we've run out of time, and that's how we end our special program focused on Sudan. We thank all our guests and correspondents who joined us for the program. Do remember that you can send your feedback to the contacts on the screen and follow us on our digital media platforms. For me, Hannah, Vivia, and the rest of the Africa Live team, thank you so much for spending this time with us. We'll see you again next time.